You know what's strange? The most dangerous man at the drag strip in 1967 wasn't the guy with the most money, the best equipment, or the biggest sponsor. It was a broke kid from Culver City who would climb into anything with an engine and never once ask what he was getting paid. And on the last night of that year, that same kid strapped himself into a car he openly admitted he didn't like, because a ride was a ride, and Mike Sorokin never turned one down in his life. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the driver's history almost forgot. If you're someone who cares about the real stories behind the golden era of drag racing, the ones that never made it onto posters or into the mainstream conversation, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing. When most people think about top fuel drag racing in the 1960s, they think about the names that survived. Don Garlits, Don Prudhomme. Big names, long careers, plenty of interviews and documentaries to cement the legacy. What almost nobody talks about is the entire layer of racers underneath that, the guys who were just as fast, sometimes faster, who were running on borrowed engines and furniture loans and sheer nerve. Mike Sorokin lived and died in that layer, and the story of how he got there, what he built, and what he lost is one of the most remarkable things I have ever come across in this sport. But to understand who Sorokin was, you have to understand the world he came out of, because it shaped everything about how he raced and how he thought about racing. Los Angeles in the 1950s was something genuinely unlike anywhere else in the country. You had beach culture stacked right up against hot rod culture, and those two things fed off each other in ways that produced a very specific kind of young man. Venice, Culver City, Santa Monica, these weren't separate communities so much as one big connected scene, and the connective tissue was cars. Always cars. There was a burger stand on the corner of Jefferson and Sepulveda in Culver City called the 19, named for what the burgers cost. It had a big parking lot in the back, and that lot was basically the unofficial headquarters of Southern California street racing on a Saturday night. If you were a car-obsessed teenager in that neighborhood, you were there. Sorokin was there constantly. He attended Venice High School, then took 2 years of electronics classes at Santa Monica City College, because at the time he figured that was the responsible thing to do. He said later he found out what he actually wanted to do was drive. And I think that's one of those things that sounds simple when you say it, but the actual act of choosing it, of walking away from the responsible path, toward the thing that terrified your father and offered no financial safety net, that takes a very specific kind of person. His father Ben hated all of it, hated the street racing, hated the strip racing even more, and made his feelings known by showing up and trying to talk Mike and his friends out of it in real time. It didn't work. Look, it never works when the person you're trying to talk out of something has already decided, deep down, that this is the only life that makes sense to them. And Sorokin had already decided. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like a pretty standard story. Kid from California, loves cars, gets into racing, the usual arc. And up to this point, yeah, it kind of is. The standard arc is where it starts. What made Sorokin's story extraordinary is what came next and who he found when he got there. 2 other Santa Monica City College students named Bob Skinner and Tom Job had a genuinely harebrained idea. They wanted to build a top fuel dragster from scratch, out of a garage, with no money and no real experience to speak of. Skinner's mother owned a place called the Red Apple Motel on Wilshire Boulevard, and she signed for what was technically a furniture loan, around $5,000. Skinner and Job cashed it and started scavenging parts. Job put it plainly years later. They didn't have money to buy anything. This was pure Bucksdown independent racing at its absolute finest. Here's what most people don't realize about that era. The gap between what a well-funded team could do and what a broke independent team could do was enormous. We're not talking about a slight performance disadvantage. We're talking about the difference between purpose-built components and whatever you could locate and afford before the next race. And yet, somehow, that car ran. Not at first. At first it genuinely did not run. Other racers who watched Skinner and Job pushing it up and down the return road at Lyon's drag strip, trying to get it to fire, thought they were a pair of geeks who had wandered in from a classroom. They weren't wrong about the classroom part, but they were very wrong about what these guys were capable of. Before they found their driver, they burned through a handful of candidates trying to put the thing through its paces. Roy Tuller, Bob Muravez, and a sports car racer who worked the floor at Carroll Shelby's shop named John Morton, who everybody called Lotus John. Morton wrote about his one ride in that car in his own memoir years later, and it is worth hearing, because it tells you exactly what these machines were like from the inside. He described his leg trembling on the clutch before he even left the line. By the end of the run he was shaking like he had just survived something. He never drove for them again. Skinner eventually developed what became a kind of legend around the pit. He would drop a handful of coins and see who could catch them before they hit the ground. Reflexes were the whole job. Somewhere in that process, Mike Sorokin passed the test and the seat was his. And from the moment he sat down in it, the dynamic was completely clear. He had zero interest in the mechanical side of the operation, and he made that absolutely plain from day one. Tom Job remembered him saying that's your problem anytime anyone tried to bring him into a conversation about the engine. He just wanted to drive. He wanted to win. That was the entire scope of his professional interest. What those competing teams didn't know, and what made Sorokin's apparent lack of curiosity into an asset rather than a liability, was that Job was quietly one of the most sophisticated fuel chemists in the entire sport. He hadn't just eyeballed nitromethane percentages the way most teams were doing. He had actually gone deep into the underlying chemistry, while the rest of the field was still using cheap hydrometers and guessing. Skinner and Job were running their engine on a mixture close enough to pure nitromethane that most of the field considered it borderline insane, and they dyed it blue so nobody could steal a sample and reverse engineer the ratio. Sorokin didn't need to know any of that. He just needed to know when the tree went green, and that part he had completely covered. The media needed a hook for 3 Beachtown kids showing up to races on a furniture loan, and they found one fast. Skinner and Job rode skateboards around the pits between rounds and dressed like they had just come from the beach, while every other crew around them was buried under the hood trying to stay competitive. Reporters started calling them the surfers. None of them actually surf. When someone finally pressed Sorokin directly on the nickname, he told them with a completely straight face that surfing kind of scared him. They leaned into it anyway because it worked, and because the image of 3 guys who looked like they belonged at a beach bonfire somehow going out and beating the most buttoned-up professional operations in the sport drove those same operations absolutely up the wall. And they were fast. Genuinely, undeniably, embarrassingly fast for a team running on that kind of budget. They ran San Fernando and Fontana and Riverside and Irwindale and Pomona and Bakersfield, almost every significant stop on the West Coast circuit, and at nearly every one of them they walked away with top eliminator or low elapsed time or top speed of the meet. Sometimes all 3 in the same weekend. The winning was so consistent that it stopped being surprising and started being expected, which is one of the strangest positions for a team with no money to find itself in. One night at a 1965 meet at Fontana, they blew the side completely out of their only spare engine block during a semifinal. Instead of loading up and going home, they turned the car on its side, taped cardboard over the hole in the block, wrapped a hose clamp around where a connecting rod used to be, and sent Sorokin back out on what was left of the motor. He drove it like nothing was wrong, right up until the entire thing detonated at the top end. They lost that round. But the story traveled through every pit in Southern California, and it told people exactly what kind of driver they were dealing with. He simply did not care what he was strapped into, as long as it moved. Somewhere in the middle of all this winning, Sorokin met a young woman named Robin Rains. She worked as a trophy girl at events and eventually became the team's parachute packer, which in the world of top fuel drag racing is not exactly a minor responsibility. He liked to joke to reporters that she was the best parachute packer he had, and that it was nice having a pretty girl around instead of just a bunch of racers. They got married, and Sorokin wrote to a fan in Michigan not long after to tell him so. He mentioned that he had been married about a month, and that he liked it just fine. That fan's name was Joe Bicey, and he lived in Lansing, Michigan. For reasons that are honestly lost to time, he and Sorokin had struck up an actual pen-pal correspondence that ran on for a couple of years. In one letter, Sorokin apologizes for sending a used team shirt because there were no new ones left, and jokes that at least it's clean. In another, he talks about the covered trailer they're building for the tour and admits their race car isn't exactly beautiful, but at least it runs. These aren't the letters of a star. These are the letters of a broke kid from Santa Monica who can't quite believe his own life is working out. And they still exist. Joe Bicey kept them, and they have since made their way to people who care about this history. I want to sit with that for a second because it matters. We know a lot about the famous racers of this era because they gave interviews and wrote books and appeared on television. We know almost nothing about the layer of racers just below that, because nobody recorded their thoughts and nobody filed their correspondence. These letters to Joe Bicey are a window into something that almost never survived. This is where it gets really interesting. By 1966, the surfers had built themselves into one of the most respected independent operations in the entire sport. And that spring, they were headed to the biggest race of their careers. The 1966 Bakersfield March Meet at Famoso Raceway was the single most prestigious independent fuel race in the country, full stop. That year it lived up to every bit of that reputation. Something in the neighborhood of 100 top fuel dragsters entered, which meant the field had to be split across 2 full days of eliminations just to work through it. Every significant name in the sport was there. Don Garlitz, Connie Coletta, Art Malone. Every single one of them was operating with more sponsorship money and more infrastructure behind them than 3 guys who had gotten their seed money from a furniture loan taken out by someone's mother. Sorokin fought through 2 full days of eliminations. In the final, he faced James Warren, who red-lit trying to match him off the line. Sorokin set a national elapsed time record right around 7.34 seconds in the process. The surfers became the first independent team in history to win the March Meet outright. Let me be clear about what that means. Not the first independent team to do well at the March Meet. Not the first independent team to make a deep run. The first to win it, period, against a field that included the best-funded and most experienced operations in the entire sport. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's impressive, but surely the well-funded guys just had a bad day, right? Here's what most people don't realize. The surfers didn't win that race because everyone else stumbled. They won it because Joe's fuel chemistry was genuinely better than what the competition had figured out, and because Sorokin left the starting line faster and cleaner than anyone else in the field. Both of those things were real, repeatable advantages, not lucky break. The win wasn't a fluke. It was the result of 2 very smart people doing the technical work correctly and one extraordinary driver executing under pressure. By his own later telling, Sorokin's son Adam was conceived that same night in Bakersfield. His mother told him directly when he was old enough to ask, and there's no real reason to doubt the general timeline, though it's worth being honest that this comes from family memory rather than a dated document. Either way, the timing lines up closely enough that it's become part of how the family tells the story, and honestly that's exactly the kind of detail that makes a person real rather than a legend. He wasn't just a racer. He was a husband, about to be a father, writing letters to strangers in Michigan about used team shirts. Then everything the surfers had built came apart almost overnight. And here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, because it didn't come apart because of a crash or a mechanical failure or a sponsorship disaster. It came apart because Skinner and Job could read where the sport was heading, even when almost nobody else wanted to admit it yet. Look, the economics of professional drag racing were shifting in a very specific direction by late 1966. The money was starting to flow toward owner-driver operators who could lock down their own sponsorships and build a commercial brand around their own name. Don Garlits understood this early. Don Prudhomme, a rising star who would eventually become one of the most commercially successful racers the sport ever produced, was already positioning himself exactly that way. A three-man independent team surviving purely on race winnings had no clear path to compete with that model long-term. The math didn't work and Skinner and Job could see it. So on Labor Day weekend of 1966, they simply walked away. They sold the entire operation, including a brand-new full-bodied car they had just finished building. That car went to a buyer named Richie Bandel out of Brooklyn. Around that same time, Sorokin wrote to Joe Bicey holding his month-old son Adam while he scratched out the letter. He joked that his handwriting was worse than usual because the baby was in his arms, and that Adam was a very good-looking kid. He mentioned the new car going to Bandel and admitted the whole team hated to see it go. There's a specific kind of grief in that sentence that I find difficult to get past. This man helped build something genuinely historic, something that no one else in the sport had managed to do, and then watched it get sold piece by piece while he was holding a baby he needed to feed. Both Skinner and Job begged Sorokin to walk away with them. Quit while they were all still in one piece, with nothing broken and a March Meet win on the record. He refused. Racing wasn't a hobby for Mike Sorokin. It was his actual income. He depended on win lights to cover his rent and his groceries the same way anyone else depends on a paycheck. So instead of retiring at the top with his partners, he went looking for a seat. What followed was 16 months of Sorokin driving for whoever would put him in a car. First a brief stint with legendary engine builder Ed Pink, known around the sport as the Old Master. That lasted a couple of months. Then a short run with a builder named Blake Hill. Then he landed what looked like a real opportunity, driving a second entry for Roland Leong, a Hawaii-born car owner whose Hawaiian dragsters were some of the best prepared and most consistently fast machines on the West Coast. With engine builder Keith Black wrenching and Leong managing the operation, Sorokin actually won the 1967 Stardust Meet out in Las Vegas. It was a genuine win under real pressure. But the results across the rest of that season never quite matched what everyone had come to expect from him during the Surfers' years. When Leong eventually had to downsize back to a single car, he chose driver Mike Snively over Sorokin. So Sorokin needed a new ride again. Through all of this upheaval, the letters to Joe Bicey kept arriving in Lansing, though the tone had shifted in ways that are hard to miss if you read them carefully. One of the later ones mentions getting laid off from a day job because his employer didn't appreciate him taking 2 weeks off to go race in Bristol. He mentions blown pistons and a car that won't qualify. The restless energy that had always made him electric at the starting line now reads differently in those pages. The ground underneath him was getting less stable by the month. By December of 1967, Sorokin had landed in a car owned by a Bakersfield racer named Tony Waters. The two of them had already run together 3 times, and all 3 outings had ended the same way. First-round exits. 3 straight first-round exits. For a man who had won the March Meet and set national elapsed time records, 3 straight early exits in an unfamiliar car represented something more than just a bad run of luck. This was not the winning combination it needed to be, and everyone in the pits around them knew it, including Sorokin himself. This would be their 4th race together. But here is the thing that almost nobody in the stands that night understood. This was supposed to be his very last race as somebody else's hired driver. Sorokin and a fellow Southern California racer named Paul Gami had just ordered a brand new chassis together and actually picked it up the day before, on December 29. After years of climbing into other people's cars because that was what was available, Sorokin was about to become an owner again on his own terms. One more race in somebody else's uncomfortable machine, and then he would finally be building something that belonged to him. That morning, Roland Leong spoke with Sorokin on the phone. Sorokin told him flat out that he didn't particularly like the car he was about to drive, but that it was a ride, and a ride was a ride. He asked Leong whether he'd have some spare parts on hand for the new car once they started finishing the build, and whether Leong would be around on Sunday to talk it over. Standing in the staging lanes later that same day, the two of them spoke briefly again about getting together that weekend. Leong has said in the years since that it is a genuinely eerie thing, talking to someone about their plans for tomorrow and then turning around to find out there is no tomorrow. To understand exactly what happened next, you have to understand what was happening with clutch technology across the entire sport that season. And I know clutch technology sounds like a deeply unsexy thing to focus on in a story like this, but stay with me, because this is where the mechanical and the human collide in a way that defines everything. In a top fuel dragster, the clutch is what connects the engine to the driveshaft. In 1967, these assemblies were stacks of iron discs pressed together under enormous spring pressure. Teams across the country had started noticing that a small amount of controlled slippage in that assembly seemed to produce smoother, quicker runs. The word spread through the pits the way technical gossip always does in motorsport, quietly and quickly, until everyone was chasing the same effect. The problem was that nobody actually understood the engineering behind why it worked. Teams were running components that were already operating at the very edge of what the metallurgy could sustain, and now they were experimenting with those same components blind, with no data and no safety margin. When one of these assemblies failed under full power at those speeds, the result wasn't really a mechanical failure in the conventional sense. It was closer to a fragmentation event occurring between the driver's legs. Chunks of iron spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, suddenly with nowhere to go except outward. These events were happening with increasing frequency through 1966 and 1967, and the sport had not yet developed either the technology or the regulatory framework to meaningfully contain them. Nobody was requiring blast shields. Nobody was mandating specific containment standards for clutch housings. The cars were running faster every month and the safety infrastructure was standing completely still. That is the exact machine Mike Sorokin strapped himself into on the last night of 1967 at Orange County International Raceway. The track had only opened its doors that August, which tells you something about the pace at which this world was expanding. New strips, new audiences, new opportunities, and the same cars with the same fundamental vulnerabilities they had carried all year. First round of eliminations. Tony Waters' car in the near lane. Sorokin staged it the way he always did, cleanly and without hesitation. The lights dropped. He launched. The car ran normal through the beginning of the track, through the part where you can still feel like you have some relationship with what's happening underneath you. Then somewhere in the second half of the run, the clutch let go. Tom Honeycutt was sitting up in the bleachers with a friend, watching the round. He remembered hearing a horrendous metallic sound and looking straight down as the car passed below him. The rear wheels had stopped completely while the car was still traveling at well over 100 miles an hour. The front section of the car, the part that contained Mike Sorokin, had separated entirely from the rest of the machine. The roll cage tumbled down the remaining length of the track, over and over. Honeycutt described it as looking like a rag thrown out of a ball, bouncing and spinning the entire length of the strip. Reports of the exact speed vary. Some accounts put it at around 170 miles an hour, others closer to 220. Nobody was measuring it with any precision in the moment. What every single person who was there agrees on is that it was fast enough that nothing inside that cage was ever going to walk away from it. The physics of the situation didn't allow for a better outcome. Here's what most people don't realize about the silence that settled over that track afterward. It wasn't the silence of shock alone. It was the silence of people who had been telling themselves, every single weekend they showed up to these events, that the math would eventually work out for someone else. That the car that came apart would be some other team's car. that the driver who didn't come back to the pits would be someone they knew less well. And then the math stopped working for Mike Sorokin, and the silence was the sound of every person there confronting the fact that there was no someone else. There was only whoever happened to be in the seat on the day the numbers came up. Tom Honeycutt remembered another driver, a close friend of Sorokin's, standing near his own trailer in the aftermath and refusing to accept what he was being told, asking repeatedly which hospital they were taking Mike to, as though the question itself could change the answer. Someone finally had to tell him there was no hospital involved. Ed Pink, the same old master that Sorokin had once driven for, was out on the return road that night with a customer. He said decades later that it was a sad, sad night, and that he still carries the memory of it among all the better ones he accumulated at that track. Mike Sorokin was 28 years old. He left behind a 19-year-old wife and a 1-year-old son who would grow up knowing his father only through photographs, magazine clippings, and the stories his mother made a point of telling him. This is where it gets really interesting, and I mean that in the most uncomfortable possible way, because the question that this story keeps dragging me back to is not what happened on the track. The what is documented. The question is what it means that the sport allowed it to happen, and whether the people running these events and sanctioning these cars understood what they were allowing. Look, I want to be careful here, because it is genuinely easy to apply 2024 standards to a world operating in 1967, and that is not a useful or honest way to think about this. The people building these cars and running these events were not indifferent to human life. They were operating in an era before the systematic study of motorsport safety had produced the tools and the language needed to address the problems they were encountering. They were learning in real time, and the price of that education was being paid in the most brutal currency available. But here's the thing. By December of 1967, this was not the first clutch failure the sport had seen. It wasn't even close to the first. These failures had been accumulating for a year and a half, and the pattern was visible to anyone who was paying attention. Teams were continuing to push components past their rated limits because the competitive pressure to do so was enormous, and because the regulatory environment had not caught up to the point where anyone could be stopped. The specific failure mode that killed Mike Sorokin was not a mystery by the time it happened to him. It was a known risk that the sport had not yet found the will or the mechanism to eliminate. What changed after Sorokin's death, and after a series of similarly catastrophic clutch failures in the months and years that followed, was the development of containment technology specifically designed to manage these events. Blast shields, containment rings, better metallurgy, stricter inspection protocols. These didn't arrive immediately, and they didn't arrive without resistance from teams who saw the added weight and cost as competitive disadvantages. But they arrived, and the sport is measurably safer today because of what was learned from the losses that accumulated in that period. Mike Sorokin is not usually cited in the mainstream history of motorsport safety the way some other drivers are. His name doesn't come up in the same breath as Dale Earnhardt or Ayrton Senna when people talk about deaths that changed the sport. He was a regional West Coast racer operating below the level that attracted national media coverage, and he died in December, during a period when the sport's attention was already turning toward the following season. The coverage was local, the obituaries were brief, and the institutional response was gradual and largely invisible to anyone who wasn't inside the industry. But the people who were there remember him clearly. Tom Job, who went on to have an extraordinarily significant career in motorsport after leaving the Surfers, has spoken about Sorokin in interviews over the years with a directness and warmth that tells you everything about how that team actually functioned. Bob Skinner stayed connected to the racing world in various capacities and has similarly spoken about Sorokin as someone whose absence left a real and permanent gap. Roland Leong, who had that last phone call with Sorokin on the morning of December 30th, has described it in interviews as one of the most haunting memories of his entire career. He has returned to it repeatedly over the decades, to that conversation about spare parts and Sunday plans, to the normalcy of it, to the way it ended. Now, you might be thinking, why does this story matter now? Why dig this up? What is the point of spending this much time on a racer most people have never heard of, from an event that happened more than half a century ago? Here's my honest answer. I think Mike Sorokin matters precisely because he isn't famous. The famous drivers have monuments. They have documentaries. They have dedicated chapters in official histories. Their names get mentioned at events. The unfamous drivers have the people who were there, and when those people are gone, they have nothing except whatever managed to survive in boxes and attics, and the memories of fans who thought to hold on to a handwritten letter. The history of motorsport is not just the history of the winners who went on to be remembered. It is also the history of the people who built the thing the winners were winning at, who drove just as fast and hit the wall just as hard, and who left behind families that grieved them just as completely. Sorokin's story is part of that history whether it appears in the textbooks or not. What strikes me most, when I go back through everything that is known about him, is that handwritten letter with the baby. The one where he's holding 1-month-old Adam Sorokin in his arms, and trying to write to a fan in Michigan at the same time, apologizing for the bad penmanship. This was a man who was simultaneously a nationally competitive professional drag racer, who had just won the most prestigious independent fuel race in the country, and a broke 26-year-old kid who couldn't afford to print new team shirts and had to mail the used one instead. Those two things existed in the same person at the same time, and I think that duality is what we lose when we reduce racing history to a list of elapsed times and championship points. The stats tell you what somebody did. The letters tell you who they were. This is where it gets really interesting in terms of what happened to the people around him. Tom Job did not stay out of motorsport after walking away from the surfers. He eventually joined the bicycle industry, brought the same obsessive technical precision he'd applied to nitromethane chemistry to bicycle component design, and became a key figure at a company called Shimano and later at others. His contributions to what competitive cyclists ride today are documented and significant. The same brain that was dyeing fuel blue to prevent competitors from stealing his formula was eventually applying itself to indexed shifting systems and derailleur geometry. I find that genuinely remarkable. The intellectual capacity that made the surfers competitive against teams with 10 times their budget didn't disappear when the dragster got sold. It just found another application. Bob Skinner moved in different directions but stayed connected to the car world in various ways over the years. Roland Leong continued running top fuel cars for decades and is remembered as one of the sport's significant figures from that era. The Hawaiian dragsters became iconic. He is still alive and still telling the story of that last phone call. Adam Sorokin, the baby in the letter, grew up. He has spoken in interviews about what it was like to grow up knowing his father through second-hand accounts and photographs, and about the specific experience of discovering more about who his father was through the recollections of people who had known him. He has described his mother as someone who made a deliberate and sustained effort to make sure he understood who Mike Sorokin was, not just as a racer but as a person. She kept the clippings. She told the stories. She made sure Adam grew up with a father even when the physical reality of that was impossible. That specific effort of making sure a person is remembered by the people who come after them is something I keep returning to in this story. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about historical memory. It is not passive. It does not just happen on its own. It requires someone to decide that a particular life is worth preserving, and then to do the actual work of preserving it. For the famous drivers, institutions do this work. Museums, sanctioning bodies, media organizations, they have both the incentive and the infrastructure to maintain the record. For everyone else, it falls to individuals. Joe Bicey in Lansing, Michigan kept those letters. That was a decision. He could have thrown them away. He could have moved and lost them. He kept them deliberately, because something about that correspondence, about the realness of the person on the other end, made him feel like they were worth holding on to. And because of that decision, made by a fan in a Midwestern city who probably never imagined anyone would be talking about it decades later, we have something irreplaceable. We have Mike Sorokin in his own words, not filtered through a race report or a magazine interview, just a young man writing to someone he liked, apologizing for the shirt, bragging about the baby. Here's what most people don't realize about the way motorsport history gets written. It is almost entirely constructed from the records that survive, and the records that survive are almost entirely the records that someone with resources decided to preserve. Official race results, championship standings, manufacturer press releases, these things get kept because they serve ongoing institutional purposes. Personal correspondence, pit lane conversations, the memories of people who weren't famous enough to be interviewed, these things disappear unless someone makes a specific choice to save them. This is why I keep coming back to these stories. Not because they're more dramatic than the official history. Honestly, the official history of top fuel drag racing in the 1960s is already more dramatic than almost anything else going on in American motorsport at the time. I come back to them because they are more complete. They show you the sport as it was actually experienced by the people inside it, not as it was packaged for external consumption. When you know that the surfers got their seed money from a furniture loan, the March Meet win means something completely different than it would if you just knew the elapsed time. When you know that Sorokin picked up the new chassis the day before the race that killed him, the crash at Orange County is not just a tragedy. It's something with a specific shape, a future that was already taking form and then wasn't. When you know that he was holding a month-old baby while writing to a stranger about a used shirt, the name Mike Sorokin stops being a data point in a historical record and starts being a person. And I think that shift from data point to person is the most important thing any of these stories can accomplish. Because once someone is a person to you, their absence means something. You understand what was lost in a way you can't when you're just reading a name in a list of fatalities. The drag racing world of the late 1960s was full of people who understood that they were operating in a genuinely dangerous environment and who chose to operate in it anyway. I don't want to romanticize that choice or suggest it was made without cost, because we've spent this entire video looking at exactly what it costs. But I also don't want to flatten it into a simple narrative about recklessness or institutional failure, because that isn't accurate either. These were people who loved what they were doing with an intensity that most of us will never feel about anything. Sorokin said it himself, plainly and without apology. Everybody has a dream, and this was his, and he was living it. He said that while he was winning, before the money ran out and the good seat disappeared, and he was climbing into someone else's uncomfortable car because a ride was a ride, he was still living it, even then. Even in a car he didn't like, on the last night of the year, with a new chassis waiting in a garage that he would never get to finish building. That, to me, is the real story. Not the crash. Not the fatality statistic. Not even the March Meet win, as genuinely historic as it was. The real story is that this person existed, completely and fully, right up until the moment he didn't. That he wrote letters and held babies and told jokes about shirts and made plans for Sunday. That he was fast enough to beat everyone who showed up against him on the best day the sport had to offer, and human enough to get laid off from his day job because he took 2 weeks off to go racing. Now, you might be thinking, what do we do with a story like this? And honestly, I think the answer is simpler than it might seem. You remember it. You tell it to people who don't know it yet. You understand that the history of this sport, of any sport, is wider and deeper and more human than the official record suggests, and you stay curious about the parts that don't appear in the main text. Mike Sorokin was 28 years old. He left behind a 19-year-old wife, and a 1-year-old son and a new chassis that never got finished and a fan in Michigan who kept his letters for the rest of his life. He was the first man to win the Bakersfield March Meet as an independent, and he drove a car he openly didn't like on the last night of 1967 because a ride was a ride, and he never once in his life turned one down. That is who he was. That is the whole of it. And I think he deserved to have someone say it out loud. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first went deep on it, please share it with someone who loves this era of racing. These stories survive because people decide to pass them on, and that's the only way they survive. Hit the subscribe button if you want more of this, because there are 100 more names like Mike Sorokin that deserve the same treatment, and I am nowhere close to done. I will see you in the next one.